The trade deadline has passed, but that does not mean the Pacers are done making moves or tweaking their roster this season. What moves can or should they still make this year? How will they look come playoff time? We'll break it all down today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy All-Star break, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes, and today, I have no idea what day this is coming out. I'll be in Hawaii on my honeymoon. We're talking about the Pacers roster moves they could or could not make down the stretch of the season. I do this show every year after the trade deadline because while the trades are obviously the biggest thing, potentially the most important thing, the best way to add impact players, the moves made after it can be just as impactful or shaking in some way, like adding Trevor Booker for the Pacers the first year I covered the team, or adding Wes Matthews the following year, or adding any other O'Shea Brissett type, converting a two-way contract, which got them significant players in the past, adding someone on a two-way, which has helped them this year after doing that last year. There's so much that can, and in the Pacers case, maybe should, still happen as the season progresses. We'll try to get into it all today. Hopefully, this is pre-recorded, like 4 or 5 days before it comes out. No news has happened in Pacerland that makes this seem extremely irrelevant. But I will go through my thoughts on what you could expect to see the Pacers consider and stuff that I will have to talk about on this podcast in various detail as the season progresses. And the Alex Len signing not happening opens up quite a few doors for this discussion, because that is usually the biggest picture thing to consider post-trade deadline is filling out your roster. And the Pacers opened up that roster spot on deadline day when they sent James Wiseman to Toronto. Their temporary patch was Jahlil Okafor, right? He's still on the team, at least probably as the time of this comes out. He's on a 10-day deal that will last through the game they play against Memphis on the 20th. So they added a center, which is revealing. But that is, we'll talk about two separate things here, 10 days and regular deals. You know, the thing that is the most obvious the Pacers can do is they could sign somebody. And in theory, if they waived someone else, which there's no good waiver candidates on their team, unless they are in a total bind for roster spots, they could waive James Johnson, I suppose. They're not going to do that. So they could sign somebody with this open roster spot. Jahlil Okafor currently has it, which told us the Pacers identified the same thing Derek Kramer and I talked about after the trade deadline. If they're going to use that 15th spot, a center is the way to do it, or at least to me makes the most sense, but it's not the only way, right? So what actually makes sense for the Pacers with a sign? Like Alex Len at least can play. There's a reason the Lakers tripped all over themselves to make him be their backup five, which they needed to after that Charlotte trade fell through. And there's a reason the Pacers wanted him to be their third string five. Like he's a valuable guy. And the Pacers, without the stretch they just had with Turner and with Thomas Bryant, hasn't missed a game yet, but knock on wood there, a center would be nice. So is Jahlil Okafor the answer, right? With the Maddens, he's been fine, but still certainly a lot to work through. His game is more throwback than modern, and the Pacers have shown they need guys who can add efficiency or add specific kinds of skills to fit in at center. So I'm rambling about the center spot, and I don't mean to do that. What I mean to talk about is the actual transaction, and that is that the Pacers can still add someone to their team if they want to. And that player is currently, as of me talking, and hopefully as of this publishing, Jahlil Okafor via a 10-day deal. Those are possible after January 5th of every season, so any available player could sign a 10-day, and I have a hunch that in the absence of an Alex Len level player becoming available again at center, they would only sign 10 days until March. And I talked about that with Derek after the trade deadline, but by pushing that can back over and over, right? By using 10 days until then, the Pacers can see what the buyout market really is going to be and then sign whoever they want to sign for the rest of the season. Players waived by midnight on March 1st or earlier are eligible to play in the playoffs for a different team. That's why that's considered the end date for buyout. So right now it's Jahlil Okafor. Maybe it will be again if they sign him to a 10-day on, let's say, February 21st. That would last through March 3rd, which is funny because let's pretend the buyout market ends on March 1st. Those players clear waivers by the 3rd. Convenient, right? So it's possible Jahlil Okafor gets a second 10-day before the Pacers have to make their choice, but they have an open roster spot to add a player. I want to talk about first, yes, I think center is the most obvious position of need. They already signed a center, so I think the Pacers have already kind of admitted that, yes, this would be the thing they think they need the most is insurance behind Turner and Bryant. And even with those two, Turner played a lot of games last year. He was healthy before this neck thing this year. Bryant hasn't missed a game. Center is still probably the position that deals with the most injuries. There's the most contact. Those players are putting the most, in theory, size and weight on their muscles and bones. You need insurance at the spot. And Toppin's done 5 as the backup 5, but they don't want to rely on that every night. So I'd keep an eye on the center position for an addition. Regardless of that, I talked about that already this season and on the show. Who could be available, right? The buyout market for 5s is going to be interesting. I made this list before they were going to sign Alex Len, and thankfully, I did not delete it. So I can still talk about it. Let's talk about what the buyout market could materialize into, because I think there's another group of players that at least made me go, that aren't just center. So the center list of guys that I've read about that maybe could pop available, although in some cases I don't think so. Larry Nance Jr. with the Hawks. They have Capella, who they could re-sign. They have Onyeka Okongwu, who's pretty good and young. So they need Larry Nance, but he just got hurt, and he's kind of good. Like, there's a chance the Hawks would want to keep him and re-sign him for the same reasons the Pacers need a center. Having a third big and having insurance at that spot is valuable. I extremely doubt he would be a buyout center. I also have Chris Boucher on this list. The Raptors probably will not buy him out. It doesn't make a lot of sense. He's good. He actually plays for them. But they probably can't afford to keep him now after this Ingram extension. I'm just keeping an eye on his future. But he has, I believe, an option year for next year. Same to Andre Drummond, who the Sixers, I think, would like to not have him, but we'll see. I don't think he would take a third center role. So the other names I had typed down as potential buyout market centers. One is Daniel Tice, who, former Pacer, got traded away from the Pelicans, then waived by the Thunder at the trade deadline. Well, guess what? He's not available. He signed in Monaco. He's going back to Europe, so he's not going to be joining an NBA roster. And I think it's already been determined that maybe he should have played more last year, but not really the best fit with the Pacers style. One of the guys I typed was Alex Len. LOL. He has already signed with the Lakers and spurned, or maybe not spurned. Who knows how that actually went. The Pacers, he's unavailable. And that leaves 2 more names. Cody Zeller, who is now with the Houston Rockets after being salary dumped there from the Atlanta Hawks, and Mo Bamba, who is currently a free agent, waived by the Utah Jazz after being traded there from the LA Clippers. Keep in mind that the Clippers would have rather had Drew Eubanks than Mo Bamba. Mo Bamba's young and interesting-ish, and a reason I'm going to talk about him for more than 2 seconds here. I like Cody Zeller. He's an Indiana native. He went to IU. That's great. He might not be able to play at the Pacers' speed. That is where Bamba does at least show something to me here, is that, well, I think he's pretty overrated by the masses and probably wouldn't help as much as people think. He can kind of shoot, and he's kind of mobile, and if the Pacers needed to find somebody who, like, part of what's made Thomas Bryant such a good fit with the Pacers is he can play like, he's not as good as Jalen Smith at basically anything, but he can play like Jalen Smith, right? And that's proven to matter. Mo Bamba had a season where he took 4 threes a game, right? And he is, not as good of a defender as the stats suggest, but he's a fine player who is mobile and does take threes. I think if you're going to look at a style fit for the Pacers' third center, Mo Bamba is an option. And Jahlil Okafor could even continue to be an option. Let's say he continues to impress on a 10-day, right? He already got his first NBA action in 4 years. Maybe he could get the spot. We'll talk about the Mad Ants as a separate segment later. But of the buyout centers, I think Mo Bamba is my favorite name, but not for the same reasons he's everybody else's favorite name. And he would certainly be the third center behind Thomas Bryant and Myles Turner. But keeping going on the adding guys or using the roster spot to sign a player who could be playoff eligible or be available on the buyout market, what about a movement shooter? We've been talking all season with the Pacers about how their shooting is streaky or inconsistent. Why not get another one, right? That could help in a pinch. There's at least some utility to that. There's a reason they wanted McDermott last year in the Buddy Hield trade. There's not a lot of shooters who look like they could be available, though. Bojan Bogdanovic, maybe, but he's been hurt all year. Is he even good anymore? Seth Curry, maybe, but why would he want to buy out in Charlotte, right? So there's just, if one becomes available, that would be the only thing, if I'm the Pacers, that I would think hard about instead of getting another center, is can I get a movement shooter to fill this roster spot that makes any sense? And then the only 2 that even kind of struck me as maybe were Seth Curry and Bogdanovic. 3 other players I typed down in they're unique that could matter to the Pacers and give them something. But remember, like, if they're not better than Thomas Bryant and they wouldn't play over Jarris Walker, there's pretty much no reason for the buyout player to ever play. They wouldn't play for the Pacers. So why would they sign with Indiana, right? That's why Alex Len is like a third big. Okay, that makes sense for money reasons, I guess, if you want to be on a winner. But keep that in mind. Anyone they sign is probably somebody who just wants to be on a good team instead of a bad team. They probably wouldn't play. But these guys made me stop and thinking that they're at least good enough to think about playing. Javonte Green's good. He's making the minimum for New Orleans, so a buyout seems unlikely, and he's not as good as Jarris. So he's just a decent player, right? If he becomes available, I guess that makes sense. I typed Ben Simmons down because he's fun and interesting, but he wouldn't play. PJ Tucker can guard. He can't really do anything on offense. The Pacers could use defenders. I suppose they could sniff that around. They already have a vet. I don't think he'd play very much. That's kind of the extent of that name list for the buyout market. And then the other thing you could consider, at least for the Pacers on the buyout market, is, well, if you can't get anybody who's going to play and you're happy with Obi Toppin being your third five or whatever, or however you want to, Enrique Freeman's in there. What about just snapping up a young guy, regardless of position, and just seeing if they can develop in your system, right? That list, lots of guys. Jaden Springer got moved from the Celtics to the Rockets and waived. Jalen Hood-Schifino, Johnny Davis, Sidy Cissoko, he already signed with Portland. David Roddy already signed with Philly. Bones Highland got waived. Wendell Moore is out there. Cam Reddish might be out there, but I doubt it. I think the Lakers kept him so far. Marjon Beauchamp might end up out there. I kind of doubt it. Colby Jones, I bet, sticks with his team. Caleb Houston, I bet, sticks with his team. Patrick Baldwin, he was a former first-round pick, got waived. So there's some guys who could, I suppose, become available that are young and interesting. But if I'm the Pacers, I'm looking for somebody who can maybe play if there's an injury. And then the last list of guys that I would at least have to talk about, it would be the Mad Ants guys. We've already seen the Jahlil Okafor call-up. The Pacers do a call-up almost every year. Dakota Mathias has played very well for them. He's 2A eligible. Jahlil Okafor is on the Pacers right this second. Kyle Mangus is 2A eligible. He's played pretty well. And Cameron McGriff, he's a former NBA guy with the Blazers. He's playing well for the Mad Ants this year. Perhaps he could be a two-way call-up or a 10-day experiment guy at some point while the Pacers try to sort all this stuff out. Okay, that is the buyout market. Those guys could be signed to any standard roster spot or to a 10-day deal as the Pacers sort out what they want to do with their 15th spot. That's not the only thing they could do. And I've skipped over some guys on the Pacers roster specifically who I think are related to this. What else could be coming the Pacers' way? Let's look at the two-way guys, contract conversions, G League signings, and plenty more as we continue here on Locked On Pacers. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. And then waiting and wondering and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives you your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find your every deduction possible, file every form, every investment, and everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com, only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. We're back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making this your first listen today and every single day. Make Locked On NBA your second listen. You can get the latest and greatest from around the association there every single day, including weekends. It's great. I host every Tuesday night, so post on Wednesday with Wes Goldberg. I will not be doing that this week, but normally I do. You can check that out wherever you get your podcast. Something else that the Pacers could do involves their two-way contract players, something they did last year. Before I get to that, I forgot to include one thing in the first segment. What I like to do when I do these post-trade deadline move things is cite an example of the Pacers doing the move already to just show you what it could look like or what it has looked like and why it matters. For example, we just talked about the buyout market in 10 days. So, for example, Trevor Booker comes in and gets, I guess, TJ Leaf, I guess nobody's, you could say, rotation spot as the backup four under Nate McMillan in 2018, right? He was in their playoff rotation. The following year, after Victor Oladipo gets hurt, Wesley Matthews comes in, and he got to start. That was a big deal for him, right? He played in the postseason too, although they got swept by Boston. O'Shea Brissett became available after the trade deadline, although that was because they waived somebody, not traded somebody. Regardless, they signed him to 10 days before signing him for a 3-year deal. He played quite well in that setting and worked his way up, right? So that scenario, that buyout market or 10-day or whatever scenario post-trade deadline has served this front office well in different ways post-trade deadline. So has what I'm about to talk about, which is two-way contracts and conversions and signing other guys to two ways. For example, here, Edmund Sumner got converted from a two-way to a standard deal. I forget who backfilled his two-way spot when that happened a few years ago. Terry Taylor and Dwayne Washington, I believe, got converted from two ways to standard spots. They were backfilled by Nate Hinton and Gabe York late in their season. Gabe York again had that happen to him the following year. And then last year they did this where Kendall Brown had his two-way converted to a standard spot, and then he played garbage time in the postseason, and that allowed them to sign another two-way player, which was Quentin Jackson, and that ended up paying dividends this year because they got to keep him via restricted free agency, and then he actually played for the Pacers this year. Like, all this stuff matters, even if it's not just for one season. It could matter in future seasons. Sumner, him getting called up, mattered in future seasons, right? Gabe York ends up sticking for 2 years. Terry Taylor sticks for a year and a half, 2 years, I can't remember. And now, right now, Quentin Jackson, we'll see what happens with him. So that is a possibility post-deadline. I believe the date is March 5th. I'm not sure if that's hard and fast every year, but I believe that's the case. That's the last day teams can sign players to two-way deals, which matters here because, in theory, if the Pacers are going to do this, where they would convert one of their two-way contract players, which right now is Enrique Freeman, Quentin Jackson, and Ray J. Dennis. If they were going to convert one to a standard contract, they would do it by that day so that they could then backfill their two-way spot and be using all of their roster spots as appropriately as possible, right? So that is very conveniently right around the time the buyout market fully materializes. So if you're the Pacers and the buyout market comes and goes and you don't like any of the options available or none of them agree to sign with you because you have very little minutes to offer, perhaps they do what they did last year. Converted Kendall Brown and then backfilled his spot with Quentin Jackson. So that is another possibility. An advantage of that is Jackson has years of service already, but Freeman and Dennis, if they wanted to convert them, and by far, by the way, I think the leader for this kind of transaction is Freeman. Freeman specifically is a rookie, and his minimum salary is lower. So they could actually sign him and still have wiggle room to think about other things if they wanted, or they could sign him to a multi-year deal using their mid-level exception, like a 3 or 4 year deal, which is even better than what the 2-year deal you can offer for minimums. Kendall Brown got a 2-year deal last year, although the second year ended up being non-guaranteed, and he got cut in camp. You all know that story. So here's why I think Freeman is the leader for that group. Even though Quentin Jackson has had the most NBA impact by far, like he was decent for them in November, and they'd have less wins this year than they would if he didn't play, even though his impact kind of dwindled by the end. Freeman's been the best with the Mad Ants this year. I mean, he's shooting threes down there and making them at a decent enough clip. His rebounding is impressive. He's very efficient. His pick and roll game. He's a great defensive communicator, right? He's just good. I know that seems silly to say, but Enrique Freeman can play. And I don't know if he's NBA ready yet. He's still kind of working on being a modern big, right? And that's something I just talked about when talking about centers in the last segment. Is the guy that I'd be looking for as the Pacers is the guy who can, in theory, provide the most spacing and speed and elements like that. Freeman certainly provides speed elements, but how exactly that shakes out for him and what his true position ends up being is still unclear. He's a little short for a center, right? But he can't quite shoot well enough or defend in space well enough to play the 4. So we'll see where this shakes out. But I think he'll probably end up as a 5 long-term. He's just got to improve a little bit, and he's gotten better from the start of the season till now. If they decide they want him to, he is the best option available for their depth big, and they go into the playoffs with their center rotation of Turner, Bryant, Freeman, and I guess Toppin. And they saw Toppin do well in the playoffs last year in lots of matchups. I think that would be okay, injuries permitting. And then you get a multi-year Freeman deal that would probably be non-guaranteed for every season beyond this one. That's not a bad route to go. That's worked for them before in many ways. And so one, Freeman is like decent and would be worthy of that already, especially if the buyout market stinks. And if the buyout market stinks, it's worth it to do this, even if you don't think Freeman can help you in the postseason, because then you just are using your roster spots in the most effective way possible. Because then you can get another guy in the door for a two-way, right? So I would at least think about this as the Pacers, especially Freeman, continues to play well. I think Michael Scotto reported, months ago that Freeman could be a contract conversion candidate at some point. And if they do that, they could sign someone else to a two-way. Last year, I thought they would look at some of their Mad Ants guys like Mangus, like a couple others. They opted to go outside the org. I know they were looking at some other guys before they landed on Quentin Jackson, and that turned out to be great, right? Because he had a good summer league. He stuck. He helped them this year, right? And that's why you do that kind of stuff. If they stick with the Mad Ants guy, I already mentioned a lot of the names I think they would look at. Cameron McGriff, Kyle Mangus, Dakota Mathias has played probably the best of the names I just said, but he's on the older side, but he is two-way eligible, and he is, in fact, a good player, and he's a wing, and he can kind of shoot it, right? That would, in theory, if they did that string of transactions, well, Mathias couldn't play in the postseason if he was on a two-way deal. That could quasi get them a movement shooter and another 5 and be a cheap way to do that with getting multi-year deals. So that is always something a team can do after the trade deadline, is do some stuff with their two-way, sort stuff out in that way. And it wouldn't shock me if the Pacers looked to go that route again, because that's been fruitful for them in recent seasons, and they have a candidate that makes the most sense at a position of need even, right? So keep an eye on this. When March comes, if they haven't signed anybody to a permanent deal, or if Jahlil Okafor is still dancing around on 10 days or has just not impressed, we'll definitely talk about this again. But that is always on the table, and might, pending who gets waived and does not, end up making the most sense. Couple other small things to talk about here on moves the Pacers could still make, and we'll get to them now to close out this Locked On Pacers. One more break here, guys, so we can talk about Hungary when it comes to grocery shopping and meal planning. I had this ongoing problem. I just run out of time between work, life, and everything. Trying to eat healthier constantly makes me feel stressed out. Go to the grocery store, buy things you don't need, then end up with no time to actually cook and sticking to your health goals. It's a struggle for everyone. That changed when I discovered Hungry. It's been a game changer. It's the easiest way to eat healthy without all the stress. With Hungry, it's like having a personal shopper and nutritionist all in one. They take care of the grocery shopping, recommending meals and groceries based on your taste and health goals, from anti-inflammatory to high protein to gluten-free options. And the best part, every meal is ready in 15 minutes or less. Quick, healthy meals that actually taste great, all delivered straight to your door. Huge time saver, and this makes healthy eating simpler. You're going to love Hungry as much as I do. For a limited time, 40%, how about that, off your first box, and a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA. That's hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA with the code LockedOnNBA to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA, code LockedOnNBA. Don't miss out. Back here once again on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making this your first listen today and every single day. Reminder, Locked On NBA should be your second listen. You can hear about the latest and greatest from around the association every single day. I have no idea what's going on in the league, so I can't suggest specific shows right now. A couple other things that are always possible post-deadline is just waivers, right? Sign somebody, waive somebody, whatever. Like the Pacers waived Kiefer Sykes and Justin Anderson late in the season a few years ago to open up spots to do some of those two-way conversions on the table. And I lightly hinted at this earlier. The problem with that, specifically for the Pacers, is they really like James Johnson. There's a reason they keep signing him and continue to keep him. He's on a minimum deal, and there's no reason to cut him to have someone else on the team, really. In fact, they sorted out their issue of not having enough roster spots and contributors to the deadline by trading away James Wiseman. And they don't have anyone else that makes sense to waive. Haliburton plays, Siakam plays, Turner plays, Toppin plays, Nesmith plays, McConnell plays, Mathurin plays, Walker plays sometimes, and they certainly want to keep young, good players on the team. Isaiah Jackson is one that people would point to because he's a dead roster spot of money right now because he's not going to play this year with that Achilles tear, at least probably not. But they have his full bird rights and restricted free agency, in theory, restricted free agency coming up. I wouldn't want to give up those free agency rights. If that gives them a cheap center for the team next year, I'd want to keep that if I'm the Pacers, right? So I would be moving on from him. Shepard plays. Already talked about Johnson. Thomas Bryant plays. Andrew Nembhard plays. They're not going to cut Johnny Furphy. They just picked him. They're not going to waive anybody. And the only one that makes more than 0% of sense is James Johnson. And they wouldn't just waive James Johnson. So there's not really a way for them to open an additional roster spot. I only bring this up as a greater than 0% possibility because let's say Turner suffers a devastating injury. Then they might need two centers, right? Then they might at least have to think about it. But I would imagine they would just try Bryant, Toppin, whoever they sign, and Freeman as their centers at that point. But it would be dire. It would be very tough to continue moving on in that way. It might just be the only thing possible, right? So keep that in mind as something that is, I guess, on the table, but I don't think would be something that the Pacers would be psyched about. Something unique this year that is not always the case is they have no one extension eligible post trade deadline, but pre the end of the season. Usually there's a couple guys I mentioned here as like, I guess keep an eye on this, right? In theory, Pascal Siakam could have had his contract extended last year after the deadline before the season ended. It made no sense for him to do it, but it could have happened. In theory, Doug McDermott last year could have had his contract extended after the trade deadline before the season ended. That one, I guess, had some reason that it could theoretically happen, but not really. It made more sense for him to wait till free agency, and he found a new home, and it all worked out for everybody, right? Like that is always, I think McConnell was in that boat where he could have been extended last year, but same thing. A lot of the times when guys can get extended, they only have 1 year left. And so it makes sense for them to just wait till free agency, unless it's clear they're not going to get a raise of some kind. Regardless, they have nobody in that boat this year, right? Turner's not extension eligible. He's on an expiring contract. James Johnson and Thomas Bryant are not extension eligible on their expiring contracts. Isaiah Jackson is not expansion eligible midseason, and everybody else has money beyond this year. So that is usually a talking point I hit pretty hard, is like, this is technically possible, but doesn't really make sense for anybody involved. This year, it's not even possible. It's not even something they can think about until free agency actually starts in the summer. So waivers, extensions, usually something I get into hard here and hit after the deadline, but not actually on the table this time around. And that is why that I think this year's moves the Pacers can still make category is a little shorter than past years. There actually is less functional things they can do than prior seasons. Their needs are more obvious and maybe filled already. They already have signed a center that they really needed. But they can't do as many things as in years past, and not even in function, but in practice, their distance from the tax makes a lot of this hard, right? They have their full mid-level. They could offer guys more than the minimum if they wanted. They could get anybody on the buyout market with enough money, but they're not going to go over the tax for somebody who's a buyout guy, right? They have to keep in mind that they can only offer, slightly over the minimum, right? And who's going to take that to come to the Pacers and not play that much? So they're probably only offering the minimum, especially because they want to be careful of bonuses and keeping their distance from the tax. They don't want to start the repeater clock too early. So I would imagine that that there's not any like funky fun stuff like in past years with extensions or offering guys more than the minimum. Like Tristan Thompson, when he got waived or bought out by the Pacers, he got more money than his buyout amount from the Bulls, right? I don't think the Pacers would do that to get somebody in the door or change their planning at all. So their post-deadline moves they could make is probably limited to offer someone the minimum to be on a better team, or hope they can find a center who could theoretically contribute in some ways, or finding the right way to convert somebody and backfill their two ways, because waivers don't make a ton of sense. There are no legal extensions, and there's just not a lot out there that feels to me like it would make the Pacers much better this year, but there are ways for them to give themselves depth insurance and potentially set themselves up better for next season, which is always smart to do if you can. And that's usually what the post-deadline moves are about, is looking ahead to future seasons. And that is where a young guy could make some sense, or the right center on a multi-year deal could make some sense, or the right conversion, setting up free agency for certain guys on two ways could make some sense. But I would not expect as many fireworks as you've seen post-deadline in past season for the Pacers this year, and we'll see how they figure out the 15th roster spot. I certainly think the answer is a center of some kind. Who it is, when they do it, we'll see. Apologies that this third segment is very anticlimactic, but such is life. Thank you guys for listening today. No idea what day this is coming out, so no idea what happens the days before or after, but at some point this week you'll hear about the All-Star Weekend and Siakam's inclusion in it. Stuff I would change in All-Star Weekend. You'll hear a mailbag, and you'll hear our East Squad show. I will not be participating because I will not be able to, but those will be your 4 shows before the Pacers hit the ground running again, playing Memphis on Thursday. I highly doubt I'm going to watch Pacers Grizzlies or podcast after it, but should be back for every game after that. We'll see. Perhaps I end up watching it. We'll see. So hope you guys enjoyed this one. Back soon talking more Pacers. Till then, everybody, thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.